At the height of his career, Louis Armstrong and his band toured Europe. The sextet had come to perform America's greatest export, jazz. But Armstrong's adoring audiences knew him as much more than a musician. He was known as the ambassador of goodwill.
It's so apt because, you know, he was an ambassador of love and he carried it with him, and, you know, people were transformed.
Armstrong's joyous stage presence electrified audiences, but many of them didn't know he was the father of jazz itself.
If you had to pick one figure in the history of the music we call jazz who stands out above all others, it has to be Louis Armstrong, because he wrote the book.
Louis Armstrong pushed music into the 20th century by inventing a new way of playing. By doing so, he helped to change the world of music and the culture we live in forever. In 1964, late in his life, Louis Armstrong recorded a tune from a Broadway musical, and it quickly became a #1 hit. The song Hello, Dolly was yet another high point in the remarkable career of an extraordinary entertainer, and proved that the 63-year-old Armstrong could still bring down the house. But Armstrong's celebrity status hadn't come easily and was a world away from the youth he spent in New Orleans. He was born there in 1901. Into a world of poverty that offered mostly dead ends. After his father abandoned him and his mother, Armstrong had to pick through garbage for food and survived brawls and gunfights in the streets.
His mother worked part-time as a laundress in New Orleans and part-time as a prostitute. This was at the time when prostitution flourished openly in New Orleans. So there he was on the margins of society. This is what he was familiar with.
Even though times were tough, there was always an occasion for a celebration. And on New Year's Eve 1913, Louis tried to impress his friends by joining in the festivities and firing blanks from a pistol.
So he pulls out the gun and he fires it, and it makes a tremendous roar. And they're all laughing, and they walk another block, and he's filled it up with more blanks, and he fires one shot, and the other kids turn around and see a cop coming. They scatter, and before he realizes what's going on, the guy's got him by the neck.
Louis was hauled off and sentenced to the nearby colored waif's home for boys. There, what seemed to be the end of his life turned out to be a wonderful beginning. Louis joined the school band and learned to play the drums, tambourine, and finally the cornet, a small trumpet-like horn. He quickly became the band's leader.
He had some sort of basic understanding that everyone that he met had something to offer. And he realized that from an early age. He listened.
A year and a half later, Louis was released back into the musically rich world of New Orleans.
There was African drumming going on in Congo Square. There's Spaniards, there were freed slaves, there were middle-class blacks, Creoles, everything that you could possibly imagine, each with its own musical culture.
There was church music, there was blues. The French Opera House was a major cultural influence in New Orleans and was just blocks from where Louis grew up. There was brass band music, there were funeral parades, and on and on and on.
The term jazz hadn't been invented yet. Ragtime had been popular since just before the turn of the century, and Scott Joplin was its most famous composer. His syncopated rhythms and catchy melodies flowed from the honky-tonks that lined the streets. Louis blew his cornet wherever he could and began picking up tips from the local legends of trumpet playing, including the crown prince of the horn, Joe Oliver.
Louis used to run errands for Mrs. Oliver and used to carry Joe Oliver's trumpet case when Joe Oliver would be performing in parades. So Joe Oliver, later known as King Oliver, became Louis's mentor and teacher.
Like many African Americans in the South, King Oliver decided to head for the modern city of Chicago and its promise of opportunity, where the Jim Crow segregation laws didn't exist. But once he got there, he remembered the talented young man he had left behind.
King Oliver had become the most famous band leader on Chicago's South Side, decided that he needed something to spark the band a little bit, so he sent for Louis. And Louis said later that he wouldn't have left New Orleans for anybody else, but when King Oliver sent for him, that was like, he had to go.
The year was 1922 when Louis's mother packed him a trout sandwich and he took a one-way trip to Chicago's Lincoln Gardens, where Oliver was playing.
First, when they saw him, he was such a rube, such a country boy with his corny haircut parted in the middle and this funereal deacon's coat that he wore, and, they just made fun of him.
But Armstrong could more than hold his own musically, and he immediately fit in with the band.
He played second cornet to King Oliver's lead cornet, and the two of them playing together amazed audiences. People would come from all over to hear the two of them play together and play in harmony and trade phrases back and forth.
Within a very short time, it's clear that he's overpowering the band. I mean, not just in terms of volume, but in terms of what he can play. After they hear him, they change their way of playing. They want to be as expressive as he is. That swinging, almost, indescribable feeling that is really the basis of modern American music. It's the platform for jazz, and it's the platform for everything that follows.
Armstrong quickly made a name for himself, surpassing his mentor in musical ability and technique. It wasn't long before he was able to split from Oliver and form his own band. In 1925, Armstrong set to work recording his unique style of playing on a record label called OK Records. The recordings done by his group, the Hot Five, and later the Hot Seven, are among the most important records in the canon of jazz history.
They became probably the most influential jazz recordings ever made because they were making some effort to codify the musical vocabulary of jazz on these recordings.
With a recording called West End Blues, Armstrong made jazz history.
The a cappella introduction to West End Blues is one of the great moments in recorded jazz history. Nobody had played anything like it before.
It was something that was sitting in his head somewhere, and then it came out at that recording session.
I think Louis, came up with things like that because he listened to everything and everybody. He would listen to Caruso and he would take all these things in and sort of, stir the pot. And then next thing you have a beautiful, like a gumbo or bouillabaisse.
And then Armstrong comes in with one note that he holds for 4 measures. And it is just one of those perfect notes that doesn't waver, it just hangs there like the moon. Bong! And then when he finishes that note, he plays this series of very dramatic descending arpeggios. Da 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 da. West End Blues says to you that this music can compete on any level you want with any great music that there has ever been, in its humor, in its emotional truth, in its vitality, its originality, its creativity, and yet it's almost entirely made up on the spot.
Before Louis Armstrong, music didn't have much of an improvisatory nature. Most of the musicians played melodies that were pre-planned.
So this is a whole different approach to what music should be. Much more informal, not as easy to repeat. That's why the recordings are so fantastically important, because we can hear all these improvised things that would otherwise be lost.
One of the best examples of early improvisation is Armstrong's May 1927 performance of his composition, Potato Head Blues.
When you hear Louis improvise, you can just take apart his solos and everything you hear. This section will be a melody. This next section will be a different melody. There's a melody here, there's a melody here, and somehow it all ties in.
He's out there on his own playing the trumpet. It would be like a high-wire trapeze artist working without a net. He swang hard, and everybody around him swung harder by being on the bandstand with him.
As soon as you heard them, you wanted to be part of that. This was the new music. And there's everything that's before it, and there's everything that's after it.
Armstrong's recordings would help make him one of the most sought-after musicians in Chicago and New York. But life outside the studio would not be easy. Just when his star was on the rise, Armstrong landed in jail. It was 1930, and he was in Culver City, California, playing at Sebastian's Cotton Club. The gig was going fine when Louis and a band member were busted during a break for smoking marijuana.
Guys in the band bus would say that nobody else had to smoke because his joints were the size of cigars, and just sitting in the bus, you got a contact high. He never did any hard drugs. He never had a problem with alcohol. All he'd like to do was mellow out with a little pot.
Armstrong's manager in New York City sent a small-time hood named Johnny Collins to California to straighten things out.
Collins came out. He took care of everything. Louis only spent a couple of nights in jail. But then Johnny Collins told Louis, "I'm your manager now." And Louis didn't know any different.
With Collins in charge, Armstrong's performances got the attention of other mobsters, and he soon found himself at the center of a power struggle over his lucrative career. A rival mobster cornered Armstrong in his dressing room and, brandishing a pistol, demanded that he come to work for his crime family. Armstrong fled. For the next 4 years, he avoided the mob havens of New York and Chicago. He toured the South for a while, dazzling new audiences with his contemporary style of music. In July of 1932, still wary of the mob, Armstrong sailed for Europe, where he was met with international fame. His fans had heard his records, and in Denmark alone, he was greeted by a crowd of 10,000 and recorded on film.
Ladies and gentlemen, the next number we're going to swing for you is one of the good old favorites. That's Dinah, Dinah. Look out there, boy. Are you ready? Look out.
Among white audiences, the tune Dinah had been a straightforward little ditty, simple and predictable. But Armstrong's innovative style and unique voice would turn Dinah and the art of song styling on its ear.
Dinah, is anyone finer in the state of Carolina? If there is that you know, show to me. Dinah, the Dixon blazing, we love the city gazing to the eyes of Dinah, me, baby.
He takes the melody and totally pulls it apart and puts it back together in a new way.
At the time, there wasn't anybody who was singing like Louis Armstrong.
Dinah, Dinah, oh, Dinah, oh, baby, Dinah.
Earl Hines said that there were guys sticking their heads out of the windows when it rained, hoping to get colds so that they would sound like Louis Armstrong.
Louis's singing and his trumpet playing are twin aspects of a single artistic vision.
It was on a trip to England that Armstrong earned his famous nickname. He had adopted names throughout his life that poked fun at the size of his large mouth. Names like Dipper Mouth and Satchel Mouth. And one British press agent garbled the latter into a name that stuck.
Did you hear what that man called? He called you Satchmo, you know, and then it stuck. You know, they all laughed and they all thought that was great.
When he finally returned to the States, Armstrong wanted to ensure that he would never again be threatened by gangsters. So he hired a manager with more mob muscle than the rest.
Joe Glaser was part of the Capone syndicate in Chicago. Not a nice guy. Great for Louis, great for jazz music. And Louis was the first musician that Joe Glaser started managing and did so very effectively. And Louis loved him. And I'll tell you why I loved him, because he made Louis feel safe. Because Louis felt he finally had a tough white man who was going to look out for his interests. What Glaser did was, let's say they were going somewhere down south where it was segregated. He got them a bus that would be safe. He made sure that they could stay in a hotel somewhere rather than sleeping in their cars.
Many times he was the only African American that was allowed to stay in all-white hotels, to eat in all-white restaurants, because his music was loved by everybody, good people and bad people.
After Louis hooked up with Joe Glaser, Louis's star really began to shine.
With Glaser behind him, Armstrong broadened his audience, recording pop tunes and even appearing in films.
Now the pale moon shining on the fields below. The darkest crooning songs are below. You needn't tell me, boy, because I know, oh, babe, when it's sleepy time down south.
But as he reached beyond the world of jazz, where he was respected as an artist, Armstrong was often relegated to stereotypical roles that spoke volumes about the country's pervasive racism.
Just because my color shade makes difference, that's why they call me shine.
In the 1935 film Rhapsody in Black and Blue, Armstrong is cast as an African tribal native.
He's wearing this ridiculous little leopard thing. It looks like a cocktail waitress. And yet, you can't take your eyes off him. Everything he does counters the imagery.
Armstrong's powerful performance didn't go unnoticed, especially among African-American moviegoers who saw him as someone who could take humiliation and overcome it.
And dignified. I mean, who else could pull that off? It's amazing.
And blacks loved it because they could see what he was signifying. That, you know, you can put us in the leopard skin, but you can't make us not men.
While Armstrong's performance was appreciated by many, jazz itself was viewed as a threat by the white establishment.
They considered it vulgar, animalistic, but the worst problem was that it was black. And what they feared most, I think, was that it was going to bring blacks into the mainstream and it was going to somehow integrate the society. And of course, their fears were thoroughly justified. That's exactly what happened. And that's, of course, one of the great achievements of jazz, the way it rewrote the social issues in the United States.
But Armstrong rarely placed his politics before his music, and his career skyrocketed. By the 1950s and 60s, he was teaming up with the creme de la creme of Hollywood, in both films and on the powerful new medium, television.
Now, Sack, suppose you tell them in your own swinging way just exactly what jazz is.
I'll be more delighted, sir.
Oh, lovely.
There were very few Black or African American positive role models that were shown in the media. So when I was able to see Louis Armstrong on television, that was something very positive for me as a young Black kid.
Well, you know, listening to you tonight, I think I became a cat.
Well, I always thought you were the cat. And you used to sign off, big morrow, tomorrow.
He changed people's attitudes without their even realizing it at the time. He didn't wear it loudly. He didn't make a lot of noise. He made millions of people think differently about their inner racism or outer racism without their even realizing it, just by who he was and what he projected.
But when the cry for Black civil rights was rising in the late 1950s, some questioned whether Louis Armstrong had forgotten where he'd come from.
Sometimes, you know, people thought of him, especially in the 50s and 60s, he seemed so pleased with his role that they did think of him as being an Uncle Tom in the sense that he had arrived at an accommodation.
And Sammy Davis Jr. attacked him, and Adam Clayton Powell attacked him. I mean, all these other guys, they're calling him a Tom. It's preposterous.
Nobody ever called him a civil rights leader, but he certainly was a, you know, one of many voices in the earlier days of the civil rights movement.
It was an event in 1957 that touched a nerve in Armstrong. While on tour in North Dakota, Armstrong saw on television images of Black students in Arkansas who were spat upon and denied access to public schools because of their race. Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus and President Dwight Eisenhower did little to uphold the Supreme Court ruling of Brown versus the Board of Education, which prohibited racial segregation in public schools.
This incensed him perhaps more than anything he'd ever seen in his life, because of course he knew exactly the kind of thing that they were going through.
When a young newspaper reporter arrived at his door for an interview, Armstrong couldn't hold back any longer.
Louis let loose with both barrels. He said that Governor Faubus of Arkansas was an uneducated plowboy, that President Eisenhower was two-faced and had no guts, and the way they're treating my people in the South, the government can go to hell.
And the kid can't believe what he's getting from Louis Armstrong. He's supposed to be, you know, the nicest performer, you know, almost been accused of being a Tom and a minstrel. Well, it made front page news everywhere.
The moment Glazer found out about it, he got on the phone and wanted Louis to retract it, and Louis said, no way, no, this is what I said, and this is what I mean.
Armstrong said Eisenhower should go down to Little Rock. He should take the hand of a little black kid and the hand of a little white kid and walk them into that school.
Days later, President Eisenhower sent in federal troops to enforce the desegregation ruling and escort the students to school.
Louis sent Eisenhower a telegram. God bless you, Daddy.
It's impossible to read the day-to-day news stories leading up to it and not think that Louis Armstrong's statements did not have some effect.
But Armstrong's criticism of government policy did little to diminish his growing popularity at home and abroad. The man with a fifth-grade education was now known around the world as Ambassador Satch, the ambassador of goodwill. Even though Armstrong was a world-renowned celebrity, some felt that his music had turned bland.
Louis had faded from the musical scene in the 40s. He seemed to lose his way musically. He was playing what became known as traditional jazz, which was New Orleans jazz. In the post-war environment, this seemed very, very backward-looking. So the great innovator was suddenly becoming, seeming like a, sort of old-timer.
By the 1950s, a new generation of jazz musicians, like Miles Davis, Charlie Parker, and Dizzy Gillespie, had taken center stage.
The music was changing, and it was frightening to Armstrong. It's always frightening to us when, especially if you're the king of the hill for so long, and then somebody pulls the rug out and says, you don't matter anymore, old man.
But the old lion did team up with a new guard when Armstrong and Dizzy Gillespie performed a tune called Umbrella Man on live television in 1959.
It's Dizzy's group, it's his working sextet. They'd done it 100 times, they recorded it. Louis had never seen it before, but he jumps in. And then there was this one spontaneous thing where Dizzy aspirates the P in parasol, and Louis says, "Your parasol is juicy, boy."
Your parasol, it made me fall. Your parasol is juicy, boy. Oh, turn that way. It looks like rain.
Dizzy was often fond of saying that he had misjudged Louis Armstrong and realized that Louis Armstrong refused to let any of the problems that were going on take the joy from his life. We were just seeing someone who was happy.
About Louis, he says, "Without him, no me."
But a lifetime of playing the trumpet had taken its toll on Armstrong's upper lip, which was scarred and required constant attention. His musical style necessarily changed over time. He sang more often than he played, and his playing became more economical.
As he got older, he wasn't able to do the things that he could do on the trumpet when he was younger. But along with the loss of those abilities, there's something else added to his music. Something else came into play. There's a maturity that came into his music that makes every note that he played a gem.
In the later years, there is a grandeur to his playing. Every note that he plays, it's almost as though he picked it off a tree and got just exactly the right note.
Music is something that I think, especially in Louis Armstrong's case, is reflective of the spirit. And he had to have had a very strong spirit to play music like that.
The pale moon shining on the fields below. The folks are crooning soft and low. You needn't tell me, boy, because I know, yes, when it's sleepy time down south, yes.
Louis Armstrong would go on performing with his band until only weeks before his death in 1971.
I've met his neighbors, I've met the guys who played in the band with him, I've met fans who heard him from the audience, I've met all sorts of people. I've never heard a bad word about Louis Armstrong. Everybody loves him, everybody adores him. I don't know anybody else I can say that about.
Till the break of day, yeah.
I love Ellington's line. I think it sums it up. He said, Louis Armstrong was born poor, he died rich, and he never hurt anyone along the way.
Yeah, take me back where I belong.
Music is one of the things that can bring people together, especially Louis Armstrong's music. It's happy. He provided the world with so much. Music, but humanity and spirit as well.
How to do, everybody?